My name is Erica Patterson. I'm 36 years old, and the night my family abandoned me at a train station in Europe was not a misunderstanding, not a fight that went too far, but a decision they had already made. It started as an argument about money, the kind we'd had before: quiet voices, tight smiles, questions about why I wouldn't send more funds immediately, and why I suddenly wanted control over my own finances. I reached for my ticket at Roma Termini and realized it was gone. Then I checked my bag. My wallet wasn't there. My phone was missing. I asked where my things were, expecting irritation or excuses, but instead, I got silence and movement. They walked toward the platform gates together, unhurried, coordinated, like they were following a plan. One of them wouldn't look at me at all. I followed, confused, turning into alarm as the departure board changed, and the truth hit me all at once. My ticket hadn't been misplaced. It had been canceled. I wasn't delayed. I wasn't forgotten. I was being left behind. I demanded an explanation, my voice sharper now, but they disappeared into the crowd without turning back, leaving me standing there with no way to travel, no way to call for help, no way to even prove who I was. That was when a man stepped directly into my path. He didn't look rushed or curious like everyone else. He looked certain, like he'd been watching long enough to understand exactly what was happening. He leaned close and said, "Pretend you're my wife. My driver is already on the way." I laughed once more, from shock then disbelief, and that's when he smiled, not warm, not reassuring, just confident. "Trust me," he said quietly. "They'll regret this." I didn't know his name, didn't know why he was helping, and didn't know what I was walking into. But I did know I had seconds before security noticed I didn't belong anywhere anymore. So I took his hand and walked away from the platform. What I didn't know yet was that back in the United States, paperwork was already being prepared with my name on it, designed to take control of my money before I even realized what had been done to me. The car pulled away without hesitation, and the quiet that followed felt deliberate, as if the moment I stepped inside, everything moved onto a different track. The man across from me didn't rush to fill the silence. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to reassure me. "My name is Graham Sinclair," he said, measured and precise. "What I offered you back there wasn't spontaneous, and it wasn't personal." He explained that he needed a woman beside him in public for a defined period of time, not as a partner, but as proof of stability during negotiations that depended on perception as much as numbers. Investors, boards, and partners trusted patterns, not emotions, and right now the appearance of order mattered. There was no story about fate, no implication that I'd been rescued. He laid out the terms like a contract spoken aloud: limited scope, strict confidentiality, no emotional expectations, and complete clarity on what each of us gained and risked. In return, he would provide immediate security and access enough to keep me out of trouble until I could stand on my own footing again. I listened closely, noticing how carefully he avoided promises he couldn't control. When he finished, he waited, not pushing, not softening the edges of what he'd said. I agreed because safety, even temporary, was a rational choice, and because staying exposed carried a risk I couldn't afford. As the city receded behind us, the urgency that had driven me moments earlier began to settle into something heavier. With the crisis temporarily contained, my thoughts turned inward and doubt crept in, disguised as self-criticism. I told myself I'd escalated the argument earlier, that refusing to move money quickly had sounded like defiance, that pushing back had forced a reaction I should have anticipated. Families don't always handle boundaries well, I reasoned. Stress distorts judgment. But the more I replayed the days leading up to the trip, the less that explanation held. I remembered my mother asking pointed questions about specific accounts, not casually, but with an attention to detail that felt unnecessary at the time. I remembered my brother bringing up authorization paperwork as if it were a harmless hypothetical, asking who could act on my behalf if something went wrong. I remembered being told it would be easier if someone else kept track of the tickets, that it would reduce complications. Each moment had seemed practical on its own. Together, they formed a sequence I hadn't questioned because I trusted the intent behind them. Sitting there now, I realized how easily concern could be used as cover, how organization could mask preparation. I said nothing to Graham about these thoughts. He wasn't the audience for them, and I didn't yet know what they meant in practical terms. What unsettled me wasn't just the possibility of manipulation, but the timing. If those conversations had happened before the trip, then the argument hadn't created the situation. It had justified it. The car continued forward steady and controlled, while the idea settled uncomfortably in my chest. What I had believed was a spontaneous rupture was starting to look like a sequence that only required the right moment to unfold, and the more I examined it, the clearer it became that the moment hadn't been accidental at all. Morning sharpened everything. With the night behind me and the noise stripped away, I made a call, driven less by strategy than by a quiet sense that time mattered now. Avery Mills answered cautiously the pause before her voice settling into place, telling me she already suspected why I was calling. I didn't rehearse or unload the story. I asked a narrow question about whether anything had been initiated in my name before I left the country, anything that would leave a trace. She warned me gently but firmly that family disputes framed as protection could escalate fast and turn procedural before they ever felt personal. I acknowledged the risk and asked her to check anyway. When she came back, the hesitation was gone. What she found wasn't ambiguous. It was orderly. Emails dated days before the trip, written in neutral language that avoided emotion and focused on process, outlined next steps and contingencies. A working file bearing my name had been created and revised while I was still in the United States, its metadata clean and intentional. Notes referenced my absence as a window of opportunity rather than a complication, a condition to be used, not managed. Dates were the detail that closed every door of doubt. These documents existed before any argument could be blamed for them. As Avery explained how the pieces connected, the structure revealed itself with unsettling clarity. Blake had driven it not with a demand for total control, but with a push for temporary authority, the kind that sounds reasonable and urgent at the same time. The language emphasized safeguarding assets and preventing impulsive decisions, a frame designed to calm reviewers and accelerate approval. There were no dramatic claims, just careful positioning. Avery pointed out the status matter-of-factly. A preliminary petition had already been submitted, incomplete by design, enough to establish a record and justify follow-up actions once circumstances aligned. I listened without interrupting, focusing on the mechanics rather than the sting. What disturbed me wasn't only that it had been planned, but how deliberately it had been engineered to appear responsible. When the call ended, the impulse to confront them rose hard and fast, a desire to expose the timing, to force explanations before the narrative could settle. I didn't act on it. I chose silence, not because I was unsure, but because reacting would spend leverage I hadn't yet counted. I knew that choice wouldn't make sense to everyone, and I didn't try to dress it up as moral high ground. It was calculation, plain and uncomfortable. As the morning stretched on, I reviewed the trail Avery had shared, noticing how each step depended on my absence to proceed without resistance, how the sequence assumed I wouldn't be present to object or clarify. The argument hadn't created urgency, it had provided cover. The trip hadn't been a risk, it had been a condition. The more I examined the design, the less room there was for coincidence. This wasn't a reaction to a fight that got out of hand. It was a process waiting for the right moment to begin. By the time I closed the files, the realization settled with a steadiness that surprised me. Whatever explanation they offered next would be polished and plausible, but it wouldn't be the start of anything. It would be a continuation and understanding that changed how I measured every move from there on. The office stripped emotion out of the situation the moment I sat down, and Vincent Cole made sure it stayed that way. He didn't ask how I was holding up, or whether I wanted reassurance. He reviewed the documents in front of him and told me without hesitation that we could win, but not quickly, and speed was the one thing I didn't have. He explained that courts were cautious by design when family members claimed they were acting in someone's best interest because protection sounded reasonable even when control was the real objective. The danger, he said, wasn't a final judgment against me. It was the interim. If a judge accepted even a fraction of their argument, just enough to justify intervention, while questions were sorted out, I could temporarily lose control over my finances. It wouldn't require proof of incapacity, only uncertainty. Time would do the rest. Vincent was precise about how that uncertainty worked, how filings framed in careful language could trigger oversight without proving wrongdoing, and how reversals took longer than approvals. He made it clear that reacting emotionally would weaken my position, and that silence without preparation would be read as instability rather than restraint. What we needed was evidence that existed independently of the conflict, proof that showed consistency over time rather than competence under pressure. The work unfolded methodically. I began assembling income records that demonstrated reliability rather than growth contracts that showed continuity, tax filings that reflected routine management, and correspondence that documented decisions made without external influence. Vincent recommended independent evaluations not as a defensive gesture, but as a way to remove speculation from the equation. Neutral assessments carried more weight than any personal explanation I could offer, and refusing them would only invite questions. Each request narrowed my margin. Every document had to align, not tell a story, but confirm a pattern. As the list grew, so did the pressure. Deadlines emerged that weren't stated outright, but implied by procedural momentum. Vincent flagged vulnerabilities where gaps could be misinterpreted and redirected me when instinct pushed toward over-explaining. He reminded me that courts didn't measure sincerity. They measured structure. The process felt less like defending myself and more like translating my life into formats designed for scrutiny. Each decision reduced to a line item that could be weighed without context. The pace accelerated as we worked, and with it came a shift from emotional strain to logistical urgency. Requests overlapped. Verifications took longer than expected. Vincent adjusted timelines on the fly, compressing steps that were supposed to unfold sequentially. Then his phone vibrated with an update that interrupted the rhythm. He read the message, paused, and read it again. The slight change in his expression enough to signal that something had moved ahead of schedule. The preliminary filing had triggered a faster response than anticipated. The court had advanced the initial review window, tightening the timeline we had been preparing against, and reducing the buffer we'd assumed existed. Vincent told me we would adapt, but his tone didn't soften the reality. An earlier review meant fewer chances to correct misinterpretations and less room for delays to work in our favor. Walking out of his office, the implication settled fully. The law wasn't waiting for us to be ready. It was already in motion, and whatever advantage we thought we had was now being measured in days rather than intentions. The atmosphere changed the instant the room settled into focus, that brief moment when conversations quieted and attention aligned around the table. This signing had been designed to be predictable, a controlled sequence where every movement and pause had already been accounted for. I stepped into my position, aware that nothing here was private, that even stillness would be interpreted. The disruption didn't arrive loudly. Miles Sinclair didn't interrupt or challenge anyone directly. He did something far more effective. Information surfaced at precisely the right moment, passed in low voices and quick glances framed as concern rather than accusation. A reference to an unresolved family matter appeared, described as a temporary protective action, incomplete, but confident enough to sound legitimate. It didn't stop the proceedings, but it shifted them. I saw it in the way Howard Raines slowed, his hand resting on the document longer than necessary, his attention drawn not by the words on the page, but by the change in energy around him. He didn't confront me. He didn't need to. The hesitation itself spoke. When I addressed the room, I misjudged the margin. I chose a sentence that acknowledged complexity where certainty was expected, a single line meant to sound transparent, that instead introduced ambiguity. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. The effect rippled outward. The room tightened. Questions stopped coming, which was worse than being challenged. No one moved to buffer the moment or redirect it. Whatever support I had was intentionally absent, forcing me to stand alone inside the consequences of that misstep. I didn't backtrack. I didn't explain. I corrected course quietly by changing what I emphasized. I returned the focus to structure rather than narrative, outlining governance, separation of authority, and oversight mechanisms already in place. I referenced independent controls without attaching them to the current tension, framing them as established safeguards rather than responses. I avoided personal language entirely, keeping the discussion anchored in verifiable operations. The shift didn't restore confidence, but it stopped the slide. Howard's posture changed almost imperceptibly. The documents stayed open. The conversation resumed slower, now measured, every word weighed more carefully than before. Miles remained on the periphery, his work already done, letting others manage the doubt he had seeded. The agreement moved forward under scrutiny rather than assumption. Conditions were reaffirmed. Clarifications were noted. The signatures did not disappear from the table. By the time the formal acknowledgement was given, it was clear that the contract would not collapse in public view. It would survive, but altered. The confidence that had carried it into the room was gone, replaced by caution that would extend beyond this moment. As the meeting concluded and the immediate pressure lifted, the cost became clear. This hadn't been an attempt to derail the deal outright. It had been designed to weaken it, to ensure that trust would no longer be automatic, that every future interaction would carry an invisible question mark. Walking away, I didn't feel relief so much as awareness. The agreement still stood, but the room would remember the pause, and so would Howard. What had nearly been lost wasn't the contract itself. It was the margin of trust that allows contracts to function smoothly, and once that margin narrows, even victories begin to feel provisional. The choice happened after the noise faded, when urgency stopped pretending to be optional and narrowed into a single workable path. The contract marriage was executed without ceremony, designed to withstand scrutiny rather than invite belief, its language deliberate and unsentimental. Every provision drew a hard line between appearance and control, preserving my assets' authority and exit rights with precision that left no room for interpretation. I signed knowing exactly how it would read to outsiders and accepting the judgment that would follow, because the document wasn't meant to persuade anyone, only to interrupt a pattern already moving against me. The protection felt thin, but real, a calculated pause in a process that had been accelerating. Days later, my family arrived in the United States, unannounced, their concern staged as urgency, and their urgency sharpened into pressure. Meetings were requested with smiles and scheduled with expectations, then reframed as necessities when I didn't comply. They came prepared, carrying transfer documents drafted in advance, explanations polished to sound reasonable, insisting that signing would simplify everything and prevent escalation. Their assumption was clear authority defaulted to them, and refusal was temporary confusion. I declined without argument, watching restraint drain into impatience. Blake didn't push in the open. He moved sideways, probing for access instead of permission. Security alerts began to surface, login attempts flagged from unfamiliar locations, requests, timed to coincide with moments when distraction might lower defenses. Then an email appeared from an address almost identical to mine, brief and confident, asking for expedited access under the cover of urgency. The phrasing mirrored my tone closely enough to slip past a casual review, built to bypass questions rather than provoke them. The attempt failed, but it wasn't a mistake. It was a test. When I confronted him, Blake didn't deny it. He reframed it as necessity, implying that control would revert to the family regardless, and cooperation would only make the transition cleaner. That was the moment pressure turned into intrusion. The contract marriage and my refusal to transfer authority recalibrated their approach. Patience was replaced by leverage. The threat followed without theatrics. Blake outlined what he claimed to possess fragments arranged to suggest inevitability, rather than truth timing emphasized more than substance. He spoke as if exposure were a tool he could deploy at will, confident that even partial narratives could destabilize what I had secured. I listened without interruption, aware that distortion, not fact, was the real weapon. When the call ended, the quiet carried weight. I didn't regret signing. I understood how it would be interpreted and accepted, that hesitation would have been judged the same way. The difference now was position. The conflict had shifted from persuasion to force, from implication to action. Whatever came next would no longer hinge on appearances or family expectations. It would be contested on legal ground, where structure matters more than sentiment and preparation outlasts intimidation. The confrontation took place in a room designed to absorb conflict-neutral colors and measured spacing intended to keep voices calm and facts dominant. My family entered with a rehearsed unity, framing everything as protection, repeating that they had acted only to shield the family from risk, that urgency justified shortcuts. They spoke carefully, leaning on intention rather than evidence, confident that concern could soften consequence. Vincent Cole let the framing stand for a moment, then closed the distance with process. His ultimatum was precise and unemotional. Correct the filings and withdraw the claims, or be prepared to explain each inconsistency under oath with documentation. The temperature changed immediately, calculation replacing confidence. Avery Mills stepped forward, next the hesitation I had heard before gone. The evidence did not arrive as accusation. It arrived as structure. Verified message records were displayed first, not cropped images, but originals, time-stamped and authenticated, showing coordination that predated the trip and mapped decisions to moments of leverage. Access logs followed precise and technical, revealing attempts from locations that aligned too cleanly to dismiss as coincidence. Each request tagged to Windows, when oversight would be thin. The final file was the simplest and the most damaging, a planning outline drafted well in advance, listing talking points, fallback narratives, and timing keyed to travel disruptions. Blake's involvement was no longer inferred. It was documented. The room responded before anyone spoke. Explanations began and collapsed mid-sentence when details refused to bend. Silence filled the gaps where certainty had been. I stayed quiet while the sequence completed, aware that proof changes power without raising its voice. When Avery finished, the story of protection no longer held. Motive stood exposed, not because anyone argued it, but because the record made alternatives impossible. The court representative did not debate intent. The instruction was immediate and procedural. Submit a written explanation for the false information provided and account for the unauthorized access attempts identified in the logs. The phrasing was formal, but the implication carried weight. This was no longer a misunderstanding to be smoothed over. It was a matter of record demanding response. I understood how my choices would be judged: the contract I signed, the structure I chose over reassurance, the silence I maintained while evidence accumulated. I knew some would read calculation where I saw necessity, and I accepted that trade. What I would not accept anymore was absorbing the fallout of their decisions in private. As the meeting wound down, resolution was not offered, but direction was. The questions had shifted, and with them the pressure. It moved away from me toward those who had assumed control of access meant control of truth. The room emptied with restraint, but the demand remained formal and unavoidable, waiting for answers that could no longer hide behind good intentions. The balance had changed, not because voices rose, but because facts stayed where they were placed. The decision came down clean and final. issued in language that needed no interpretation and offered no comfort, and the effect was immediate. The family's petition was denied in its entirety, the findings noting unreliable claims and a pattern of misrepresentation that could not stand against authenticated records. There was no applause and no speech, only a procedural conclusion that reassigned responsibility where it belonged. From there, consequences followed in ways that did not require narration. Legal fees mounted without the relief of recovery, a steady drain that turned strategy into expense. In the community they had relied on for credibility, the public record did its work quietly. Invitations slowed, endorsements softened, and conversations changed tone as certainty gave way to caution. Blake absorbed the impact most directly. Background checks raised unanswered questions, references hesitated, short-term credit tightened, and professional options narrowed into conditional offers that never quite closed. Nothing announced itself. The shift was subtle and persistent, the kind that reshapes decisions over time. I did not wait for apologies or explanations. I cut contact across every channel, formal and informal, and replaced access with structure. Council issued notices limiting communication to written form, permissions were revoked, and boundaries were set to the minimum required by law and nothing beyond it. There would be no reconciliation meeting, no mediated conversation, no attempt to preserve familiarity for appearance's sake. The line was drawn and maintained. I didn't justify the decision to anyone who wasn't bound by it, and I didn't defend it to those who were. The framework spoke for itself. Daily life reorganized around predictability rather than vigilance. Accounts were consolidated under tighter controls. Routines, simplified calendars, cleared of obligations that had once been framed as family duty. The contract marriage remained exactly what it was intended to be, functional rather than symbolic, a tool that did its job without commentary. I moved forward without rewriting the past or demanding acknowledgement of harm. Distance became a practice instead of a punishment. The absence of contact did what arguments never had. It clarified. When messages failed and calls went unanswered, the silence established reality more effectively than any explanation. Over time, the cost of what they attempted settled into limitations they could not negotiate away. I did not pursue retaliation beyond what process required, and I did not seek public vindication. Separation was the outcome. The lesson was not delivered as advice or framed as warning. It was demonstrated. I chose systems over sentiment, boundaries over persuasion, continuity over appeasement. I kept what was mine by refusing to bargain with pressure, and I ended the cycle by stepping out of it entirely. As the noise faded, what remained was workable and intact, a life arranged to function without permission, where trust was measured by conduct and preserved by distance when conduct failed. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.